Hello Commandos, I want to give a big shout out to our channel members. These guys support the channel and help create the high quality gameplay content. You guys rock. Go Commando.
There will always be differences of opinion on what constitutes broken, what is jank, and what really crosses a line over into being a negative play experience. This is really just an unavoidable reality of the competitive card gaming world. Destiny, of course, is no different than any other game in this regard. One player's jank is another player's 1.5 or tier 2 or whatever. Differences in player expectations, their backgrounds, their perceptions, and their expectations will always exist in such a diverse pool of players, and it'll lead to very different opinions on this matter. However, throughout the history of Destiny, some decks have really stood out as being especially frustrating or have really just exhausted the player base more than others. Some of these have been villains, some have been hero, they've been from various different methods, some mill, etc. What they've all really had in common is that they have a high level of non-interactivity. Hello everyone, welcome to Dice Commando and the Commando Cast. I'm Andrew with you here as always. Today we're going through a non-interactive history of Destiny. So let me kind of sum up what the impetus for this discussion is. First, we were having some discussions, as any play group has through the history of time, on the Dice Commando team Discord this week about what constitutes Tier 1, Tier 2, etc. And then of course with the Gandorkakron and the pending RRG coming, or I should say Balance of Force, erratas, etc. that we expect to come down the line, there's of course been a lot of chatter just in the community on a whole of what's broken, what's not, what should be there, what shouldn't be there, and so on. And that's just normal discourse. So, what I really want to do today is I want to sit down and I want to analyze those decks that are referred to in the opener, which are those decks that really have, over the history of Destiny, made the collective player base's blood boil, for lack of a better term, right? So what I'm going to go through are a bunch of these decks kind of over the history of time, and we're going to go through them one by one and kind of analyze, what made them really tick people off. So before we go into this list, one thing I do want to stress is that not all of these lists were necessarily even the best deck in their own meta, right? And some of the best decks were not necessarily hated, right? I want to reference the Worlds 2018, which was the Emo Kids and the Stairs meta. Those two decks really weren't hated. I mean, there were, of course, some aspects that people complained about, but fundamentally, those two decks really weren't hated. But yet we had Sabine in that same meta. People really felt very passionately about Sabine, generally one way or the other, but collectively people were tired of Sabine, right? So kind of the thesis statement that I want to keep hitting back to as we go through this is what's plagued Destiny over and over and over and over and over in its entire career are problems caused by non-interactivity. Right, so what do I really mean by that? What it means is I, as a player, feel trapped, locked down, like I can't do anything, like I can't execute my battle plan, or I have my opponent in the shape where they cannot do their right. That's just a flip side of it. So as we go through decks in the history of Destiny, I want to take a look at how this thesis statement really applies to that deck and really what its role was at the time. So let's just start from the very beginning, right? Awakenings. Awakenings itself didn't really have too many complaints overall. We had the Hyperloop, the Broken Loop combo, which they fixed pretty easily, but they fixed it by honestly creating a new mechanic, which was the set-aside zone, right? Remove from the game, whatever you want to call it. And that didn't exist prior to fixing this combo, and that was an elegant solution for it, and that's fine. And of course, they proclaimed at the time, and they've held that throughout, that they didn't want infinite loops, right? They didn't want that in there because it could be a negative play experience. And that's held solid, and I don't think very many people had a problem with that at the time. Everyone kind of knew that was going to get fixed, and everyone moved on. There really wasn't any large deck in the Awakenings meta that constituted complaining enough to get point balances or anything like that. We then move on to Spirit of Rebellion, and a lot of things kind of came off the wheels real fast in Spirit of Rebellion, right? What people were upset about first and foremost early on was action cheating. By that we mean being able to stack repeating actions over and over, doing a lot of things without your opponent being able to respond, right? Now, in that meta, you still had to, for the most part, roll out those dice. You could still roll bad and so on. But it felt really bad when you could activate, and hit without your opponent having to do anything. Right? So those were really kind of the first complaints came out. Right? The same thing was with fast hands. Right? Narada was made on fast hands, so it couldn't be played with Vader because that was killing at the time. Again, action cheating. Right? It was kind of breaking the fundamental rules that the game was sold on at the time. We then moved into, and this was still Spirit of Rebellion, but POMAs. POMAs, again, brought really non-interactivity to the forefront. Right? I forget the exact percentage, but it was somewhere in the high 80s percentage that you could hit and run to activate PO, and then activate Maz, flip, resolve. There was some percentage in the high 80s that you were going to get at least one special on that, right? And then you're throwing 5-6 damage across the table, which at the time was a big deal. Your opponent literally could not do anything to respond to it because of Maz. If you had an action cheat into that, it became even worse, right? So POMAS really was the first non-interactivity deck, and people really got sick of just how purely dominant it was, right? It was one of those decks that first really started breaking the fundamental rules of Destiny, and people couldn't do anything about it, and they got very frustrated with that. And eventually Poe was Balance of the Force so that he would be up a point. They left Maz where she was so that really she'd work with Obi-Wan, which was released. And we started to move on, and that's fine. The next deck that came took non-interactivity to a slightly different level. So this was the Rainbow Nines deck, right? And remember, back in the early days of Destiny, there was no one per turn overwrite rule, right? That was the concept of using FN 2199. You would just keep dropping stuff on him, and you just keep rolling in. And how this really kind of broke the rules from a non-interactivity standpoint is everybody still only has so many cards in their hand. They still only have so much removal in their deck. And when these dice just keep coming in and coming in and coming in, even though you may have an action to take and you may not be technically locked out, you still have to sit there and pass because everybody knows you don't have anything left, right? You're out of money, you're out of control cards, your hand's empty, whatever it may be, right? So even though it's not action cheaty, literally by the rules of the game, you can still do something, but you're being forced to pass, and that led to a lot of non-interactivity. Sure, you still had to roll well if you were on the Rainbow Nine side, but it really was just not playing Destiny for a large part of it, right? So that got its nerf. They nerfed Nines to oblivion. They changed fundamentally the overwrite rule, right? Again, we had another fundamental game change, which has worked well, fine. But the takeaway from that is, again, it was breaking the rules. It was putting people in this position where they just had to sit there across the table and take it, and it was not a good situation for Destiny. And then in Empire at War, really the big complaint was, well, there were a couple of problems that came out of that, but most of them were related to Sabine, right? Sabine, again, she had action cheating, and not only did she have action cheating, she had repeatable, consistent action cheating, right? She could drop the card, do the overwrite, pull it from the graveyard, and just keep going back and forth. So people felt that there was just nothing they could do when Sabine rolled in and, quote unquote, did Sabine things. Right? So that was a deck that people got very frustrated with very quickly. Eventually, way down the line, it actually wasn't for several sets, did they do anything there. Again, Sabine was not always necessarily one of the more dominant decks in the meta because it still did have to roll well, and that was a challenge out there. But it, again, was a deck that frustrated people because sometimes they'd just take 10 to the face and there was nothing they could do about it. And that's what really frustrated people because they felt like it was non-interactive. They felt like there was nothing they could do about it, and they didn't like being in that position. So that then brings us to kind of the next phase of Destiny, which was the Legacies 2018, Legacies Way of the Force 2018 meta, or summer 2018 meta. And that was really, to be honest, the golden age of Destiny. I think most of us would agree on that. There was still people upset when Legacies first hit about special chaining, right? When Yoda first came out, we don't see a ton of Yoda anymore, but when Yoda came out, the ability to just special chain and then claim was really bothering a lot of people, right? A very popular deck at the time people were scared of was Yoda and Poe, right? We were also seeing a ton of Yoda Hondo for that reason. Special chaining was very strong, and there were a lot of people that did not like that because they didn't have the ability to do anything, or they felt like they didn't have the ability to do anything. Now, there was a lot of counter arguments to that one that wasn't maybe as big of a problem because you just knew you had to resolve or remove one of the first specials and then it wouldn't start the chain and so on. But again, you have this feeling of what started to really nip people in the bud was the fact that they felt like they couldn't do anything and there was no option and they had no choice in the matter. They had no chance to do anything. Okay. Then, next after that really came Across the Galaxy, which led to the world of vehicle resets, right? We had Fire Spray, which ended up in the Sienna nerf, so it could only be reset one time. We had Fire Spray reset. We had Shadowcaster, which is still a problem, right? Shadowcaster alone probably broke a lot of Destiny with the need for desperate measures. So a lot of people were feeling bad in that. And again, these are a different type of non-interactivity. It kind of goes back to the FN2199 days where, sure, you have the chance to do something, but at some point you can't do anything anymore functionally, right? So yes, I'm not hitting you for 20 out of the gate with no response, but I'm going to throw a whole bunch of dice at you, or in the case of the resets, I'm going to throw dice at you, remove them, here they come again, you remove them, here they come again, and eventually you're just out of options and you're trapped and there's nothing you can do. So those decks became very overwhelming very quickly. And I do want to be fair, during that time, that was the meta at the time, so people were a little less animated about those. But functionally, it still led to the same nerf problems that's why Sienna got nerfed, it was just reset after reset after reset after reset. And at some point, the game becomes unplayable anymore and people feel locked out of the game. Next then come one of my personal hatreds of the game, which is Ewoks, right? So Ewoks came then in Spark of Hope, and they really took away, you didn't need to roll dice, right? There was no randomness involved. It was just guaranteed inevitable damage, right? It's something that Aphra has brought to the table since the Way of the Force meta. But she's always been there and just kind of brings this inevitability. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm taking damage regardless of whether I move, whether I don't, and that sort of thing. Then, of course, you've had mill popping in from time to time, right? You had in late summer of the Way of the Force meta 2018, again, backing up a little bit, you had Millpocalypse, which there was a fair amount of interactivity with that, but part of the problem with interacting with a mill deck is that you're actually furthering their win condition by interacting with them to a certain extent. So when you get too aggressive with a mill deck, you start to see people making very similar complaints, right? And that's why the term at the time was coined Millpocalypse. And then last, right, the big bad in the room has been consistently is droids, right? So droids have really, in my opinion, combined all the worst problems of non-interactivity together. They have the repeatable action cheating, and they have dice fixing, right? They get to do it all together, right? And I don't really think I need to go in depth on that. I think most people understand what the problem with droids are, and which is why they've been nerfed, 3 times now with an expected 4th coming. Right? It's just in a game where you have to roll, not having to roll is a big deal. In a game where people need to remove die, being able to roll and immediately resolve your die is a big deal. And if you can fix your die in between, you have a very broken situation there, right? And then we come to, the new big baddie in the room, supposedly, which is the Trandoshan Hunters. And again, it kind of goes into the dice fixing thing, right? You can roll in a Trandoshan. If he rolls well, you can remove. If he fixes a die, you can remove. But he has 4 dice that can get fixed. 2 dice that can get fixed, 3 dice can get fixed really with the Death Trooper. And at some point, you just start running out of removal. And if you get caught with your pants down or you get face the enemy and they take it away, there is just nothing you can do. And you have to sit there and take 12 to the face. And again, it's just a non-interactivity problem that really starts to rub people the wrong way. And even if they're okay with it at first, a lot of these decks that we're talking about really start to grind people down over time, and that's almost more the problem than the fact that people are complaining about it. It's just that you get exhausted of the same thing over and over and over. There's so many times you can sit and get punched in the face before you're like, all right, I need to stop getting punched in the face. Okay, so take a break here. All right, so again, I want to be very clear with the decks that we just got done talking about. Certainly, even if many of these decks were not ultimately the best of their own meta, a lot of them were very disdained or hated, and for sure, more than anything, had generated a lot of discussion and debate. So over the course of all gaming history, right, not just Destiny, right, this has been, this argument's been present forever, right? Take the big boy in the room, take Magic, right? This non-interactivity concept has been present in Magic, or modern Magic, I should say, and by modern I don't mean the format, I mean, the last 10, 15 years of Magic. It's present in a massive degree, and a lot of people still play that, right? You have Red deck wins, which is, just fast red deck aggro, where if they draw well, they hit you and there's nothing you can do about it. But if they don't draw well, they lose, right? That's a huge level of non-interactivity, really somewhat on both ways. You then have control, which is by definition designed for non-interactivity, really. One player gets to basically sit there and cancel everything the other player does. The player who's sitting there and getting canceled generally doesn't have a good time of it. And then you have mill choke, which is granted very similar, right? You're going to spend the game taking away, your success criteria is taking away their options, right? And again, that is, by definition, non-interactivity. So the question then is, with Magic being so successful, but yet Destiny having so many problems with non-interactivity, why, right? Why is Destiny so different? And why do we as Destiny players tend to be so much more sensitive, let's say, to the impacts of non-interactivity? So is it because many of these players that are in Destiny have come from other games and have been, they're walkaways from other games, they've gotten frustrated with that and they've left, and Destiny problem is something different? I do think there's a fair factor of that. Myself, I have been on and off with Magic over the years, and a lot of times I get frustrated with it because of that reason, right? So, and I know I'm not alone in that, right? Many have come from other games and they found a home in Destiny. They love Destiny because of the different manner that everything works, and they don't have to necessarily feel like that. It's the go back and forth. And that's kind of where I guess my conclusion is on why we in Destiny tend to be so much more sensitive is really it's Destiny's fundamental promise, right? From the very get-go was the I go, you go aspect. Non-interactivity attacks and really destroys this to a certain degree. But I want to take it even one step farther than that. So Destiny really has two things ultimately that set it apart from the other games, right? The dice is the big one, right? But there's more to it than just the dice, right? Destiny has randomness built into its core. Now, every card game has randomness and there's the draw, but Destiny really has supreme randomness because you have the draw and you have dice, right? And that was, again, remember, way back in the day, that was one of the big complaints why people didn't want to play Destiny was, oh, it's too random. So Destiny has randomness built into its core. But even more than that, the dice don't just bring randomness, they bring a huge amount of public information to the game, right? It's beyond all, I believe it's more public information than really any other game out there has had ever, in that you can see everyone's die. You don't know what's in their hand, of course, but you see their team, you can see the die out there, right? These two arguments that I'm making in concert with each other work together to create a beautiful game, a back and forth, a constant chess match, a player versus player thing. Yes, I get it. Sometimes you can just roll threes and that's all you can do. And that's Destiny, right? And that's fine. But every time a dice gets rolled, every time a card gets discarded, every time a card gets played, every action that gets taken changes the game state, right? So you have these ever-changing situations, and it's really just this chess play of a back and forth between these two players. And, even from just a personal enjoyment standpoint, when you look at what I as a player am doing, it's a constantly changing puzzle that you need to solve, right? It's not just, okay, I drew, here's the cards in my hand, here's my plan for the turn. My plan for the turn just got blown out of the water because I rolled 2 threes and I was planning on taking money or something like that, right? So you have to be adaptive, you have to evolve, and you have to react to what the other player's doing and what's going on in the game. And I think that that's become really the true strength of Destiny is not the randomness, not the fundamental design, but it's the way that everything works together to create really a beautiful, challenging situation. And I think that brings us to kind of the final crux of what I'm trying to say, or hopefully I'm successfully saying, is this limited interactivity or non-inaccurate interactivity itself really destroys the inherent beauty of Destiny altogether, right? So the game that's really fundamentally built around an ever-evolving game state falls apart when that game state doesn't change and evolve, right? It changes how you play, it changes the basic expectation. All of a sudden I'm playing checkers when I sat down to play chess, something like that, right? So when your options are taken away from you, it violates the agreement of the game. So then the question is Destiny in of itself, was Destiny in of itself as a game doomed from the very beginning? Now stick with me, right? In any game, all the good players are going to know that the best way to get your battle plan off, right, for lack of a better term, to make your battle plan successful, is to prevent your opponent from interfering with your battle plan. And the best way to do that is take their options away, right? So you have a game that is fundamentally dependent on the interactivity, but the best way to accomplish your goal is to make it non-interactive. And it also, of course, becomes harder and harder and harder as more and more and more sets are released and as more stuff is developed, because you as a developer, you want to push the envelope. You want to change things. You want to bring in new mechanics, right? How do you make things more powerful aside from just bumping their stats? You give them in-game advantages. You let people get into their hand. You counter intelligence, face the enemy. You bring things that let you, again, attack your opponent, take their options away, or, hey, let's just create cards that don't need dice and they can do damage. Let's make cards that can roll and immediately resolve dice. Right? And we've seen this again. Repeatable action cheating is a problem. Force speed, right? People hated it. Droids, again, is a problem. Continuous dice fixing, continuous resolution becomes a problem. So my overall conclusion to the question I just asked, is Destiny itself doomed? My overall conclusion is no. But the problem is it's going to be very, very difficult for the design team going forward. I feel that over the last 3 to 4 sets of Destiny really started to come off the rails with respect to what I was talking about, not having non-interactivity. I should say maintaining that balance between enough excitement, enough control over your deck versus not being able to completely lock out your opponent. And I think that's a very hard challenge that the continuing committee has in front of them, is to kind of find that balance and not go too far, right? What's going to be very easy from a design standpoint is to continue to push the envelope, but that's also going to be hard because if they continue to push the envelope, Destiny is not going to be Destiny anymore, right? So there's some very smart people there who understand the game very well, so I think we're in a good position, and that's why my overall conclusion is no. But we just need to keep in mind what has hurt Destiny repeatedly in the past, and it's repeated the dice fixing, non-interactive damage, and we have to allow time and opportunities for each player to interact and react and enjoy, or I should say, really start to play the game on that ever-changing game, right? If we make it too easy to just go in and execute your battle plan, we're not playing Destiny anymore, right? Or at least one of us is not. So as frustrating as it may be, randomness, right, as frustrating as randomness may be, it's part of the DNA of the game. And as I hope that as more cards are continued to be developed, as new strategies, new mechanics come out, that we remember that and kind of embody that the randomness is a huge part of this game. And sure, it may be frustrating to someone who believes they're a good player who lost to someone who they believe is a bad player. Oh, it was the dice roll. I get that. That's frustrating, right? But it's also what makes the game what it is. So that's my takeaway. Once we change the core of the game to not being interactive, we're not playing Destiny anymore. So I really hope that can stay really just in everybody's hearts as we start to move forward. So that's all I have to say today. I want to thank you guys for joining me, and if nothing else, go Commando.